And thank Gary very much for being here with us today. A surprise to me was that Gary grew up in the Nazarene church, and from that upbringing went to Wheaton College, which is known as a very, very prominent college, more on the evangelical side of the spectrum. And when he was there, Gary's life dream was to really serve God. And he thought he was called to do that initially as a missionary, that you serve God, you serve God's church, and you do it in a very particular way. And Gary, I'd like to ask you to talk a bit about what you learned in the process of discovering where your vocation really was.
I'm trying. I want to say thank you to Carolyn and Lyday for this exercise, and to Kathy Royal for assigning it Vestry, because it turned into these weeks of retrospect, of remembering and thanking people and events, and it just wouldn't stop. And I tried my best to keep it simple and economical, but it turned into this calculus circular equation of one event led to this person that led to this event that changed my life. It then started, and then I just said, well, God is in all of it, and I started to visualize it, and it turned into this poster. But I wanted to thank you especially for this, because a couple of weeks went by and I had this thank you visualization. But to your question, thanks to my mother, who heard God's voice and took her family to the Nazarene church, where there was a minister there from Albany, Kentucky, which is where my family is from. And she heard that voice, and I'll be forever grateful to her listening. I attended that church and dutifully went to the altar. I had a great conscience, I guess. And I went many, many times as it hammered home guilt and hell. And I was susceptible to that. And went right to Wheaton College, Billy Graham's alma mater, where we were all trying to out-Christian one another, I think. But it was just on the eve and of the Jesus movement in the early 70s. So it had a real counterculture to the counterculture of the hippie movement. So it was a happening place in the Christian culture at that time. And I was fortunate to get involved with the chaplain. I was elected freshman class president of all things, and so I was this person who prayed in Edmund Chapel, and I was someone of whom I suppose great things were expected, not least of all from myself. And so I was surrounded by these dynamic, heartfelt, intelligent individuals who would just pray down the fire. And it was in the Bill Bright I Found It years. And so we were told that the mission field was where God needed us, and that's where I was headed. And then I went to Bangladesh for relief work, and it was on the hood of a Jeep in a jungle in a bamboo hut with slides showing the story of the gospel that I felt, I don't feel called to this. I don't think this is for me. It was a revelation. And then when my mentor at Wheaton College, who brought theater to Wheaton, James Young, and introduced us to Brecht and Beckett and Mamet and Shakespeare and Shaw, and showed a film one day on the waterfront. And when I saw Brando and I saw Carl Malden as the priest at the docks saying, when you put down the common man, that's a crucifixion. And you remember that scene when he was being raised up, and I thought, that's what I want to do. But how do you add competing loyalties all of a sudden? The art part and the heart part, Christian part, what do you do with those? Well, I followed the acting, and thanks to a mentor from London who came to Wheaton, from the London Arts Group, Nigel Goodwin, knew the Beatles, was fascinating. He was a great evangelist for art and Christians in the art. Changed my life, and when I went to grad school in acting, first relief work in grad school, I thought, well, I know what. I'll take theater to the mission field and proselytize through that. Fulfilling both callings. But I asked Nigel about that. I wrote him this letter about how he might help me forward that idea and mission. And he wrote me this wonderful, life-changing letter that said, you know, Gary, there is enough truth, and there's enough God, there's enough Christ, there's enough love in theater already, in plays. Just what we need are believers in theater. Be the best actor you can be. Changed my life, and I thought, well, that's that. And I guess that's the answer, but I hadn't realized that going into the profession, with the beliefs that I had, I would be pummeled by Brecht and Mamet and Beckett with what was a fairly one-sided, narrow view of humanity. A one-sided, narrow view of how God works in the world. And so I felt like this block of ice. One way, block of ice. One way to God, block of ice that was being hammered and heated and melted into life. And so that was the beginning of the soap opera for me, which involved divorce and separation and, sexual exploration and on and on and on. It was just all of a sudden my life exploded into some sort of adolescence in my 20s that generally people experience in their teens, but that was the beginning of change. Long answer.
That's wonderful. And there was a moment during that period where Gary, throughout his life, has really heard the voice of God speaking to him through the plays, through the theater. Can you share with us that moment from Terra Nova?
There was an earthquake in my life when I was separated, and people who pray together don't always stay together, and my life was exploding. I had an identity crisis, and I was becoming an actor, and my wife from Wheaton College really didn't want to be with an actor. So we separated, and during that separation, I assumed that I would also be separated from God. So I didn't take communion, and until I found Grace Episcopal Church in New York City. And it was in those New York days that I began to realize there was grace. And that, as my mentor James Young had written me during the separation time, don't forsake the Eucharist, it's your best friend. And those words came back to me because I wouldn't take communion thinking I had lost my faith, though I still believed in God, but I didn't know what I believed exactly because everything was changing so fast. And there were plays that spoke to me, and I think in those plays, like a play called Terra Nova by Ted Talley, about Robert Scott's expedition to the Antarctica, where he he was dying, as were his men, and he wouldn't eat the dogs. And there was Amundsen, who was his rival from Norway, came to him in a dream and basically said, "This is the moment you were born for. Overcome it, handle it, make it right." And those words came to me, actually it was years later, during another earthquake. And I thought, and it was, for me, that's God speaking. And I think it was God speaking through Carl Malden. I think it was God speaking through Ted Talley. I think there are characters I've played. My mentor, James Young, used to say characterization is like an incarnation. And God is in all creativity. And so out of my, and I think all work, for that matter, when you put your heart and mind to it, there is God. So it spoke to me through that play in that moment and helped me through, and I felt that was God.
And Gary has worked in prisons and brought theater and that experience embodying and incarnating a different kind of experience and being into the prison system with him, and found that some of the prisoners had a very similar experience. Will you tell us the story about the man you worked with on Macbeth?
It was a real classroom for me at the Woodbourne Correctional Facility upstate New York. I was asked by a woman who ran rehabilitation through the arts, one of my mentors here, to join and direct. So I directed a fall scene workshop with the men, and then we entered into the world of actually rehearsing and performing the play. Macbeth we chose. They were brilliant. They worked extremely hard. And we do these plays because it has rehabilitative aspects to it. Both the rehearsing, the getting along, the overcoming the obstacles, the characters themselves break through the hearts and minds of these men or women. And in this particular case, I was rehearsing the lead actor, Tafferine, a beautiful man, had been in prison almost 18 years, shooting a gang member. And he was doing one of the final speeches of Macbeth, which goes something to the effect of, I have lived long enough. My life has fallen into the seer. Wasted. The yellow leaf and lines escaping for a second, and what is to follow along life, such as honor, love, obedience, troops of friends I must not look to have. Instead, curses. And he looked up and he said, "That's how I felt." And I said, "When?" He said, "When I shot him." And I said, "Well, do you want to talk about it?" He said, "Yeah." And he told me the story. And he said, "My life was over and I knew it." For me, I realized, in a sense, I was a missionary now, and that Shakespeare had reached through 400 years into this man's heart and mind and helped him toward healing, realization, a sense of self, understanding. And I was witness to what I thought was God's working. So ultimately, my mission, my desire to do both was coming together, not only in certain roles and plays, but in giving back, directing on occasion. And God's in all of it. And they're here, my guys. They call me G-Dog. We all have nicknames. Well, those were the Northern Ireland prisoners that called me G-Dog, but we all have nicknames.
And can you talk a bit about what it was like to go into that environment and try to open up a space of openness and vulnerability and creativity?
I was scared. I did want to say this. I was scared. Talk about God's sightings. My little boy, when I was putting him to bed one night, I said, no, something to the effect that he was 3 or something. Will you be okay? Daddy goes out and dims the light or something. I forget what I said, but he raised his little head and said, I will. I remember talking to the Lord before I went my first day in prison at Woodbourne, and I said, I'm scared. They can smell you coming if you're not coming for the right reasons. I've been warned about this. It's not like you can pray to be authentic, but you have to be honest, and I was nervous. And I said, Lord, will you go with me? And it's clear as a bell. I heard, So then I went and I felt like I'm one of the guys, I'm fine, I know this. And I love the work. I mean, they said, why are you here? And I said, because you guys do good theater. You've lived it, let's do it. And that's one of the reasons I'm here. And so, but my inspiration comes from the fact that they were in such an oppressive environment. Their jobs every day, if not every hour, was to overcome the obstacles. They were problem solvers, and they had worked on themselves for decades. And these men had been through Sing Sing and maximum security, and now they were at medium security, and they'd been through it and worked on themselves for decades. And so they were inspiring people sitting around the table working on Macbeth. They had insights I hadn't had, having done Shakespeare for 30 years, because of their humanity. So I was learning, we were learning, it was coming together. And I guess my example is they were an inspiration by overcoming, seeing their job as helping each other and overcoming whatever came, and it was going to come on a daily basis. They were going to, the correctional officers didn't want us there. That became obvious. They were mean to me. Why are you here? They don't deserve this. They've done bad things. My kids don't get theater people coming to help them. So, and some of them have college degrees, thanks to certain colleges giving it. My kid didn't go to college. They were prison. So they had all these prejudice, and the men had to face that every single day. So they were often set up for mistakes. And they had to overcome them. And I guess my point in so many of our conversations has been that when I've encountered obstacles, as opposed to this is not fair, I'm often reminded that this is a lesson. This is a muscle you need, which brings us to now, maybe.
Yeah. And one of the striking things, if you have a chance to come up and to look at Gary's philosophy, is on here is a circle with names in it of people who have been his spiritual teachers. And one of the names is Nam. Will you talk with us about how he is a teacher?
Yeah, I have pictures of my mentors. I have names of my tormentors. I didn't put the picture. I haven't come that far. But I once I got this done, Carolyn, I realized, wait a minute, I've got a lot of success events and how God saved the day and how I was in the desert and a veteran saved my life, or how I was in LA and I couldn't get work and then teaching started. I have a lot of these God sightings that were like saving graces, but I don't have the tormentors. LA should be there. Now in faculty should be there. He helped me. And there was a faculty member I didn't get along with. And he would just enrage me. Most every faculty meeting, from my point of view, he pontificated and was not kind to the students and thought he was always right and talked to. He made me angry at every faculty meeting. And I would blow up, inevitably, and have to apologize to the faculty. Afterwards, at the end, called Christy. This man is driving me crazy. So one night she said, I was in DC and she was in New Jersey, and she said, he's the most important person in the room for you. And she said, he'll make you better. Get ready. He's not going to change. You have to. Get ready. The readiness is all, Shakespeare says. She said, you're an actor. What character could get along with this guy? Be one. Sort of like AA, fake it until you make it, or Aristotle, we are what we repeatedly do, just pretend. I thought of Nigel, and I thought he would know how to handle this man. Nigel would know. So I dressed like him one day, faculty meeting coming. I didn't put on a British accent, but I thought, what would Nigel do? What would Nigel do? We often say, what would Jesus do? I thought, well, what would Nigel do? And it made all the difference in the world. I knew what he was going to do. I knew when he was going to go there. Nigel behaved differently than me. And he helped me. I played Nigel that day. And we got along great. I didn't have to apologize. I listened. I responded. I played Nigel. So, it was Aristotle too that said we are virtuous out of habit. So it's the Nike school of Christianity. Just do it. That's what we have to do. If you want to know. But now he's on there, and no, he helped me, and that was why he's there. And there have been many moments, events, people that I've seen come into my life. It's like that. Christy took this test to get into grad school, GRE, or the college test, and she said, I've read somewhere that the harder the problems are, the better you're doing. Because if you answer them wrong in the beginning, it takes you down this easy, you're like already graded, and it says, oh, I see where this person is. It takes you down this easier road, and you get these impossible problems. She said, it thinks I'm smart. It's taking me down this hard road. So whenever I encounter a really difficult situation or an earthquake, I think, you think you're taking me down the better place, So it's just it's either a trick or it's a lesson of some sort that I've learned over the years. It helps me.
And I really want to highlight two things from that story. One is, of course, that God is in everything, not just the really good things that happen to us. And that God must have forgotten us when something bad happens, that God is in everything. And the other is the role that Gary's wife, Christy, played in this story. Because how many of us, when we encounter someone who's frustrating or we're frustrated with the situation, want to talk to someone who will say, yes, that person is awful. You poor person for having to put up with them. Of course you're reacting the way you are. And Christy, with compassion, said, he's not going to change. Something's going on in you, and this is your opportunity to learn from this and to grow from this, and then helped him figure out how he might do that. Which is such a marker of a really wonderful marriage, obviously, as well as I think what good spiritual companionship looks like. That we're not here to just soothe and prop each other up, but to also challenge each other, to challenge us when we see somebody, who may not be being their best self, and may be struggling to figure out how to bring their best self to the task. And I wanted to sort of close and ask you, this theme of mentors and tormentors was another whole theme we could have taken in this conversation. And Gary sent me this week a wonderful interview of two public figures talking about the pain in their lives. And I'd like to close with that.
Well, I believe in synchronicity. I was about to do this, and over the week with Christy's family on vacation, I saw this interview with Anderson and Colbert, in which Stephen Colbert revealed his faith as a Catholic and been raised that way, but he lost his father and two brothers in I believe it was a plane crash when he was 10, which just was this amazing earthquake through the family for the rest of his life. But he began to say through his faith that he considered it, he was grateful for the thing that he wished had never happened. And he wrote that. Anderson asked him about that because Anderson lost his father at 10 and said he felt like he grew up as the person he was not meant to be, because if his father had lived, he would become the person he was meant to be. And Stephen Colbert said, no, I think there's another universe where you might have grown up in that way, but really, in my view, in my faith, this is what has made you who you are. And it's what's made me more empathetic. It's what's made me more wholly human and appreciative. So I'm grateful for that, even though I wish it had never happened. And I think I just was marveling at the fact that this is the principle we have been talking about, and there it was in another life, and I believe it with all my heart. Even though in the moment, during the event, whatever it is, it feels and sounds like the worst thing ever. And one thing, why do bad things happen to good people, is a conversation Christian I often have, and then where is God in that moment? And is there God in that moment, in the most awful moment? And I think that in the moment of crisis, as another friend of mine said to my mentor, Jim, I think I'm about to lose my mind. And he was in the acting field too, and Jim said, well, you might, but Jesus will be with you. It's not that Jesus won't let it happen, So these things are principles that I think over the course of a life you begin to adopt, as hard as they may be.
And what a gift it is. And if you go home and look up that interview, you can see Anderson Cooper
break down
on air and break down, and the relief of feeling my life has not gone completely wrong, but how I'm healed and how I have been resilient and been strengthened to be that in the face of the most horrible circumstances. That is God in my life, and that is me and who I'm supposed to be in that moment. And what a gift, and what a gift to have Gary sharing his story with us. And this is why we do this, because the more we hear each other's stories, the more we see ourselves in those stories, and the more clearly we can discern our times and how God may be moving among us in these times. So I'd really like to thank Gary for coming and for being part of this and sharing himself so generously with us today. Thank you.